Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you tonight. Thanks for being here for this period of Bible study on Wednesday night. We're studying in Acts. We're continuing our study, and we are in chapter 12. So turn to chapter 12, and we'll continue our discussion and our study of the book of Acts. Let's read these verses. We introduced them last week, and I actually got to correct a mistake from last week. So let's start with these first verses, Acts 12, verse 1. Now, about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread. And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Peter therefore was kept in prison, but prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. All right, the correction that I've got to make from last week, and a couple people pointed this out to me, is which Herod was this? We understand that the name Herod is a family name. It's sort of like a dynastic name. It's the name that this family, this ancestry of kings, it was their name. And so they were different Herods. And we talked last week, the one we remember first off in our New Testament studies, Herod the Great. Herod the Great was, as pointed out last week, he was one that's famous for building the temple that was in Jerusalem at the time of Christ. He was the one also who wanted to put to death the Christ. Remember when the wise men came seeking Christ and they inquired, and Herod said, when you find him, let me know. The wise men didn't go back and tell him. And so he killed all the babies, all the 2-year-olds and under around Bethlehem in an attempt to kill Christ. That's how bad these people were. They were a bad lot of people. So Herod the Great is the one we think of in conjunction with the time that Jesus was born. I said last week, and this is where I was wrong, I said last week he had 3 sons. He actually had 4 sons. Archelaus was a son who took his throne. When Herod the Great died, Archelaus took his throne. And he was the one that Joseph was warned about when he brought back. In fact, let me go to this. I got out some old sermon notes and copied this chart. So Herod the Great is when Jesus was born. Archelaus is the one who took his throne, and Joseph was warned about him when they came back from Egypt. And instead of settling in Judea around Jerusalem, he went north back to Nazareth in Galilee, actually in fulfillment of prophecy. But it was because Joseph was warned about Archelaus. There was Herod Antipas. He was sometimes called the Tetrarch because of the territory that he oversaw. He's the one who had a part in the trial of Jesus. Remember when Pilate found out that Herod was in town. Herod's realm was up north in Galilee and regions there. But when Pilate found out that Herod was in Jerusalem at the time of the Passover, remember, he sent Jesus to see Herod, and Herod, he didn't want much to do with that, and he sent him back. But that was this Herod. Then there was Herod Philip, and this is the guy. By the way, this is the fella who killed John the Baptist, had him beheaded. And he's actually, remember, he had taken his brother Philip's wife. Well, that's that Philip. They were brothers. So there was Archelaus and Antipas and Philip. And then there was Aristobulus. This is where I had my notes wrong here. And when I checked my sermon notes, it confirmed what a couple of people told me afterwards. They thought that this Agrippa was the son of Aristobulus, and he was. So when we read here in Acts 12 about Herod, it's this guy right here. This is who we're talking about. And as you look here, then he would be a grandson of Herod the Great. So Herod the Great, Aristobulus, Agrippa the First. He's actually going to have a son that will be Agrippa the Second. And we'll read about him later in the book of Acts. Agrippa the Second was the one who said to Paul in chapter 26, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. It wasn't this Agrippa, because this Agrippa Agrippa I is going to die right here in Acts chapter 12. And so it was his son, Agrippa II, who was the one who made that famous reply to Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. Okay, so I had that wrong last week, and I appreciate it being brought to my attention. This is the correct family tree. So when we read here in Acts 12 about Agrippa, it's this guy, Agrippa I. Okay, now let's go back here. So we've got the Herod figured out. About that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hand to vex certain of the church. His intention was to vex certain of the church. He intended to persecute, to cause trouble for the Christians. In our day and time, if you heard about a political leader who was causing trouble for churches, you would think, well, that probably involves, some regulations, maybe certain forms, tax forms or what have you that you have to fill out to maintain tax exempt status. They're giving us all kind of trouble. No, that's not what we're talking about here when it says he wanted to vex certain of the church. How so? He killed James. I mean, we're not talking about inconvenience and tax regulations. We're talking about true life-threatening persecutions. And he killed James. Now, last week, we talked about the identity of James, and this is really, there's no question here. He killed James, the brother of John. Well, that identifies who this James is. This is James the apostle, right? James and John were two of the 12 apostles. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, right? Their father was Zebedee. Jesus even gave these two brothers the nickname Sons of Thunder, remember? And so that's who this James is. This is James the apostle, brother of John. So he killed James with the sword. So how bad is the persecution? The persecution is extreme, to the point of death. I think it's interesting here. Now, really, when you stop to think about this, this constitutes the first significant governmental opposition to the church. Remember, before, it had been the Jews, right? It had been the unbelieving Jews in Jerusalem who were causing all the trouble. When Stephen was stoned at the end of Acts chapter 7, who did that? Well, it was the unbelieving Jews, right? The government wasn't involved in that. In fact, we talked at the time about that they were really stepping beyond their authority to execute someone. It was just like a riotous mob, and they executed Stephen. But here we got the government involved. This is a governmental leader who's bringing opposition to the church. This is significant. This is sort of a change. And notice that there's a change in methodology. When the Jews, when the persecution was coming from the Jews, they went after the rank and file members, and they left the leaders alone, apparently. Remember in Acts 8, they were scattered after the persecution involving Stephen. They were scattered from Jerusalem except the apostles. Right? It's almost like the Jews said, well, we're not going to get involved with the leaders, but we're going to make it hard on the followers. But now it's governmental persecution, and they're going after the leaders, right? And so there's quite a change. It's not noted. It doesn't come out in flashing headlines when you read that, but if you stop to consider it, this is a pretty significant change. This is governmental persecution, and it's against the leaders of the church, the apostles specifically. James, one of the apostles. Todd?
There's some similarities to this, Herod, I'm sure. I think it's probably his grandfather or father that was the one that killed John the Baptist.
It was his uncle.
His uncle. So there that we see that, even here these, satellite kings or whatever had some authority that the Romans had given them that to go through and do. But we know the reason that he killed John the Baptist. He imprisoned him first. But here, there's sort of some indication that he didn't like what, the church was preaching here, probably because some of his activities were being condemned by.
That's right. Maybe they were, because like John the Baptist had told Herod the Tetrarch, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. As you say, very possible they didn't like the moral standards being taught. But I tell you that, and I think that's true, but also he saw it pleased the Jews. This was a big part of his motivation, because he's a politician, right? What do politicians do? Politicians got to stay out in front of popular appeal. They got to do what they think will keep them in the best position with their constituents, with the people they oversee. And so you do what keeps them keep the people happy. Then you don't have any rebellion, you don't have any conflict. And remember, if there's trouble among the people, Herod is here, but Rome is up here. And if there's trouble with the people and Herod can't keep it under wraps, Rome's going to come down on him. He'll pay the price if he doesn't keep the peace. And so he sees this pleased the Jews. When he had James killed, it pleased you. Oh, well, let's do some more of that. Right? He's a politician. Wait.
Isn't that the reason Pilate turned Jesus over to the Jews?
He got to keep peace with them.
I mean, it already been having some riots there.
Yeah.
I think that the Roman government had already warned Pilate.
Yeah.
And so Pilate was trying to keep the peace. He knew that his job was on the line, and he had to keep the peace.
Yeah. And at that time, remember, the Jews even threatened Pilate, if you let Jesus go, we're going to tell Caesar that you're no friend of his. Because this Jesus said he was king, and you let him off the hook, and we're going to tell Caesar. That's about all Pilate needed to hear. He didn't want any of that. And so these guys are, bottom line, these guys are politicians, and we know about politicians. And so he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword, and because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter. Then were the days of unleavened bread. Well, remember, this is still, sometimes in the Bible you even hear it referred to as Jewry. This is the realm of the Jews. And so the Jews are still, obviously there's a lot of unbelieving Jews who are still observing the Passover. And actually a number of believing Jews, converted Jews, would still keep a lot of the traditional practices of the Jews, not as law, but as custom. And so there would still be quite an observance of the days of unleavened bread. Now, the days of unleavened bread were the days around Passover, right? In fact, let me make sure I got, you guys check up on me about this, but I think you had the Passover observance, and then you had, 14 days of unleavened bread following the Passover? From then and on, I think for 14 days they weren't even allowed to have any leaven in their houses at all. But this is talking about Passover time. Passover time is spring. Passover time, we're going to talk here in a minute about this, is related to Easter. And that's a bad translation right there. In fact, we go there right now. That should not say that. That should not say Easter. King James says Easter. If you're reading any other translation at all, it's going to translate it properly and call it Passover, right? This was the time of the Passover. Passover's in the spring. You know, if you think about Easter changes every year, doesn't it? I always thought it was so weird. How come Easter's not on a set day? Well, it's because Easter's calculated by the Jewish calendar. And the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, and so it changes. It doesn't line up exactly with our calendar, which is called the Gregorian calendar, which is a solar calendar. The Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, and it doesn't line up exactly because there are not exactly 12 lunar cycles in a solar year. And so they did catch-up days and stuff to line up with the year. But that's why Easter, even today, when our denominational friends observe Easter, it's different every year because Easter is calculated on the first full moon after the spring equinox, something like that. Well, it's always different, right? But it's always in the spring. Jesus was crucified on Passover week. So we know it was springtime. And actually, the appointment of Easter, if you really want to be, if you want to be technical about it, the people who invented an Easter celebration did it right because they connected it with the observance of Passover. And Jesus was crucified on Passover week, and so all that fits, but that's not what this should say. So it was the days of unleavened bread. When he apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. After all this Passover and unleavened bread celebration, after all of that observance had concluded, he was going to execute Peter. But he was waiting because these were holy days to the Jews, and so we won't do this right now. We'll wait till this is over, and then I'll get another shot of popularity by killing Peter. That's what he intended to do. But you might make a note of the fact that this right here is a very egregious error in the King James Version. That should not say Easter. Everybody knows it shouldn't say Easter. It should be Passover. The King James translators put Easter in there because they wanted to have some justification for a practice now that, the King James was translated in the early 1600s. Easter was a well-established Christian holiday. They wanted to have some basis for it in the Bible, and so they plugged it in here, and it doesn't belong here. It doesn't say Easter. It says Passover. Just a sort of a side note about that. Every once in a while, you'll come across someone who believes that the King James Version, the King James translation, is an inspired translation, that it's special, that it's given from God. And I've known some of our brethren who take that position. It's fairly rare, but I've known some brethren who take that position. There's some denominational groups that are very committed to that idea. King James only. You'll hear them identify themselves as King James only. Well, King James Version is not an inspired translation. There aren't any inspired translations, English translations of the Bible. And I don't think you'd have to look any further than this right here. If this was an inspired translation, it would not say Easter here. That's an error. Now, you know that I favor the King James Version. I typically read the King James Version, preach and teach from the King James Version. It's what I grew up on and what sounds right to me. But I have no illusions, and I don't think you should either, to imagine that the King James Version is somehow inspired of God. It's a good translation. It's a reliable translation. It certainly teaches the truth, but it has a few errors, and this is an egregious one right here. Oh, wait.
The King James Version is not even the first version translated into English.
No, that's right. Yeah, that's
And you
right.
think if it's going to make it special, it would be at least be the first one.
Yeah, that's right. And Monty often points out that if you're that devoted to King James Version, you ought to go back and try to read the original King James. It's been updated numerous times in 4+ centuries since it was first translated, and I've seen passages from the original King James translation. I can't make heads nor tails of it. It's in ancient English that the likes of which we don't even use anymore. You can't even read it and make sense of it. You don't even know what a lot of the words are. It's been changed so much. So again, it's not an inspired translation. I like it. It's the one I use and read after most often. But we got to be honest about the fact that it's just from we should be thankful that there are. In fact, we should be thankful that we have numerous English translations, good ones. Now, there's some bad ones out there too. We often talk about versions like the New Living Bible, which is not even a translation, it's just a paraphrase. Somebody just wrote down what they thought it meant. They didn't even go back to the original languages for translation. But when you talk about translations like the New American Standard, certainly the American Standard before it, today, one that's, I think, really good, and a lot of people using the English Standard Version, the New King James Version. There are a number of really good English translations, all made by men, and therefore all have the potential to have some mistake in them. But one of the things that we say about translations, that the guys who translate, the really good translations were translated by teams of scholars. It wasn't one or two guys translating, it was a whole bunch of guys. And these guys have what you might refer to as professional pride. They want to get it right, and they know they got guys looking over their shoulder. And if I mess up on this translation, it's going to make me look bad and make me look like I don't know what I'm doing. And so they're very careful to get it right. And that's why we typically say that the translations that were translated, the more translators who were involved in a given translation, the better. Because they were all checking up on one another. And therefore they were working hard to make them accurate. We should be very glad that we've got so many good English translations of the Bible. Johnny.
I think the biggest problem with the old King James is it's hard to understand. You know, the new King James, it's hard to understand.
A lot of people, now I know, I think you're right, and a lot of people state that. Now, to me, it doesn't seem that way because I grew up on it, and that's what I've always read, and the places where it's a little hard to plow through, I've plowed through those a few times, and so I kind of remember, oh, well, that's what that means. But I agree with you, especially to a new student of the Bible, if they picked up a King James Version, it might be very confusing to them. And for that reason, I would even encourage a young person, a young Christian, or even an older person who's just beginning to study the Bible to use a newer translation. It's just easier to read. I think you're right. Any other thoughts or comments? All right. So, he saw it pleased the Jews. He took Peter. He was going to, after Passover, after all of the Passover observance was concluded, he was going to bring him forth to the people. And so he was kept in prison. Now here's a part of this I think is really important and interesting. Prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. The early Christians obviously were really devoted to prayer. When there was a problem, when there was an issue, when there was a crisis, they prayed about it. And they set a standard for us that we ought to try to imitate. We ought to be people of prayer. When there's an issue, when there's a contention, when there's a problem, when there's danger. This was physical danger even. Not just spiritual problems, but physical problems. Pray about that. And so, notice, prayer was made without ceasing. We got one of our beloved brothers. Herod's got him in prison. And I don't doubt, I couldn't prove it, but I don't doubt that they understood he was almost certainly to be executed. And they couldn't go break him out of jail. They didn't have any military force to exercise. There wasn't anything they could do except pray. And they prayed. And it was powerful. And so probably a great example from the early Christians here for us is use the power of prayer. Any thoughts on these verses, Wade?
I wonder how they pray. I mean, you know, we have one man stand up, we say a prayer, and then we go on next time. But you wonder if they just came into a room and then they said, okay, you pray for Greg, you pray for Greg, you pray for Greg. And then they all just went around the room and they just said a prayer for whoever was in danger, or whoever, you know, just their own mind. And they just kept praying, different people all the way around the room, just kept praying.
Yeah, we don't know. Like you say, we don't know how they did it. I would argue that however they did it decently and in order, as Paul said, must be observed when we're together in the assemblies. But there's lots of ways to do it. There's lots of ways to do it. You're right. I got to tell a story about that. Years ago, this is when I was preaching in Knoxville. I went to a gospel meeting. A friend of mine, a gospel preacher, a friend of mine, was holding a meeting in Asheville, North Carolina. Asheville, you get to Asheville about 2 hours from Knoxville, so I went over. And when I got there, the local preacher, he was quite excited because a number of gospel preachers had showed up that very evening. And so he got up to make announcements, and he said, We have really got an unusual situation here tonight. I think he said, we've got 8 gospel preachers in our assembly tonight, and we're just going to call on every one of them to word of prayer. Okay. So he said, we're going to sing a song, and then he said, Brother Giles Painter is here. You all probably don't know that name. Giles Painter was a well-known North Carolina preacher. He's passed away now, but he was well-known in those regions. He said, Brother Giles Painter's here. We're going to ask Brother Painter to lead us in prayer. We're going to sing another song. Brother Gwynn is here from West Knoxville, and we're going to ask him to lead us in prayer. And then he went down there. Well, that's all fine, but we sang the first song, and Brother Painter started praying. He prayed for at least 10 minutes. He prayed for every conceivable thing. And I'm sitting there thinking, what am I going to pray about? But it was all done decently in order. But there, as I said, there are a lot of ways we could pray in the church. And they did. And they were praying for him without ceasing. All right. So let's go on here. Verse 6, and when Herod would have brought him forth the same night, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers bound with 2 chains, and the keepers before the door kept the prison. And behold, the angel of the Lord came upon him, and a light shined in the prison, and he smote Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, Arise up quickly. And his chains fell off from his hands. And the angel said to him, Gird thyself and bind on thy sandals. And he did, and so he did. And he said unto him, Cast thy garment about thee and follow me. And he went out and followed him, and wist not that it was true, which was done by the angel, but thought he saw a vision. This is all pretty straightforward telling, right? The time for the execution was drawing near. Herod would have brought him forth the same night. So this was the night, apparently the night before the day, the next day, Peter was going to be brought out and killed. And they had him well secured. Just when you read that, you got to be impressed that they were worried about him getting out somehow. He was sleeping between 2 soldiers, and he was bound with 2 chains. Well, there had been a previous episode where they got out of prison, remember? And maybe this is a number of years later, but maybe that still is remembered by Herod's prison keepers. And so they're taking some real measures to make sure he doesn't get out. He's between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and keepers before the door to keep the prison. Yeah, he was Peter. Peter himself was. That's a good point, Gordon. Peter was sleeping. If you knew that the next day you were going to be executed, how much sleep do you think you'd get that night? And the fact that Peter was sleeping and had to be kind of aggressively awakened, does that tell you anything? Monty?
A peace that passes understanding, and from a strictly physical standpoint, we can't understand how this man who figures he's probably going to die tomorrow is sleeping tonight, especially when he's got 2 chains. I'm sure they didn't worry about them being comfortable the way they were put on him. I don't imagine he was on a sofa, sleeper bed, whatever kind of thing. He was with their air adjustable thing, maybe just exactly right for him. So he was probably reasonably miserable from a physical standpoint. From a spiritual standpoint, he's in a position, he's a faithful servant of Jesus Christ. Probably not just itching and scratching to die the next day, but if that's what it's going to be, obviously he can't do anything about it. But he's got a peace because he knows if he dies, he's going to go be with Jesus. And what more could we possibly ask for in this life than to have that comfort of knowing I'm a faithful servant of God. No matter what happens, I can go to heaven.
Exactly right. And so I think this note that he was sleeping could certainly, we don't want to read too much between the lines, but I think there's certainly an implication there that a man would have to be at peace in the uncomfortable surroundings, as Monty pointed out, that he was in, and with the anticipation of death's door the next day. But he's at peace. What's the worst thing you can do to me? Well, you can kill me, and then I get to go be with the Lord. Remember, Paul wrote, to die is gain. Paul wasn't afraid of dying. He thought, in many ways, that was a great advantageous situation to die. So, but he's being strongly kept. But the story, pretty straightforward telling. The angel comes. A light shined in the prison. Makes you wonder if the light was visible only to Peter. I don't know what happened to the other keepers, what happened to the soldiers. It doesn't say whether they were zoned out, whether they were miraculously put into a trance, why didn't they resist? Why didn't they see the light? Why didn't they see Peter getting up and leaving? Apparently they were incapacitated in some way, and it doesn't say, and there's no use really speculating too much about it, but somehow they were not at the ready, weren't able to perform the task of jail keepers. The angel smote Peter on his side, raised him up. Rise up quickly. His chains fell off. Well, that's a miracle, right? The chains would not naturally, physically on their own have fallen off from him. So obviously miraculous things are happening here. The angel said, gird thyself, bind on thy sandals. He did so. Cast thy garment about thee, follow me. He went out. But I think it's interesting there at the end of verse 9. He didn't really think this was what he thought he was having a dream. You know, this. And you know, sometimes your dreams can be so vivid and seem so real. And Peter was thinking, this must be a dream. That's what he thought. Johnny?
This is an area where we should remember that all things, with God, all things are possible.
Yeah.
And I think that fits in this.
That's right. You could have put him inside a concrete vault lined with lead. You know, I mean, I don't care. Imagine whatever security you want. You couldn't stop God if whatever He wanted to do here, He's going to accomplish His purposes. I think you're exactly right. He thinks he's just experiencing a vision or a dream, but in verse 10, when they were past the first and second ward, so get this, the two soldiers were right there beside him. There were keepers outside the door, and he's bound with chains. He gets out of the chains, he gets away from those two soldiers, gets past the keepers at the door. There are first and second wards. When he passed the first and second ward, they came to the iron gate that leadeth unto the city, which opened to them of his own accord. So they're in the fortress, and the door of the fortress just opens. That would have been a secured thing itself. It opens. They went out and passed on through one street, and forthwith the angel departed from him. And when Peter was come to himself, he said, now I know of a surety that the Lord has sent his angel and hath delivered me out of the hand of Herod and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews. It was only at this point, Peter, you can almost imagine Peter pinching himself to say, is this real? Has this actually happened? Has what I've just experienced actually been happening? And it's not a dream, it's real. And so it takes a while for Peter. You can imagine what an incredible thing this would be to try and take it all in and make sense of it. And he's finally just coming around. He finally realizes it's actually happened. The Lord has sent his angel to deliver me out of the hand of Herod from the expectation of the people of the Jews. And when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark. Here's our first reading about Mark, also known as John. Sometimes we call him John Mark. We're going to read more about him. Here's our first reference to him. Where many were gathered together praying. Many were gathered together praying. Now, remember we said that prayer was made without ceasing by the church. And you get the idea here, that's not just idle words. That's just not meaningless banter. That really means something. Notice that this was during the night. I don't think it gives us an exact time frame, but you get the idea that this was sometime in the night. And so even late at night, the church was still gathered together praying for him. So they were very diligent in the matter of prayer and very committed to it. Now, how would Peter know where to go? I don't know that. Somehow Peter had a pretty good idea where the saints would be gathered and where they might in fact be praying on his behalf. And so when he considered the thing, so he thought, now, what do I do now? And he came to this house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname is Mark, there were many there gathered together praying. And so again, this idea of them being devoted to prayer is certainly true, and I think is evidenced by the fact that they would be here in the middle of the night praying on Peter's account, because they almost certainly understood the plan is to execute him tomorrow morning. He's within hours of dying. They're probably going to spend all night praying on his behalf. Verse 13, and as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a damsel came to hearken named Rhoda, and she saw, and she knew Peter's voice. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. And they said to her, thou art mad. But she constantly affirmed that it was even so. Then they said, it's his angel. But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. This is one of the places that just almost makes you grin when you read the account. This young woman is so joyous at the understanding that Peter's here. Peter's out of prison. He's here. She didn't open the gate and let him in, but ran back to tell the others that Peter was there. She's just overcome with joy. She's not even thinking straight herself. She's so joyous over what she has discovered. Peter is here. When she told the people that Peter was there, they said, you're crazy. You're mad. That can't be true. Herod's got him well shut up in prison. It can't be true that he's out. You're crazy. But she kept affirming it. And they said, well, maybe you saw his angel. Maybe you saw a spirit of some kind. Which, I don't know. I don't know about the legitimacy of whether that could even have happened in that time or not. Remember that we're still talking about the time in which God was performing miracles of various kinds. And so whether or not it would have been conceivable that his spirit or his angel might have appeared, I just don't know. Whether that was more superstition on their part, or whether they had some real basis that they might have expected such thing. For instance, Peter himself had been on the Mount of Transfiguration, and with Jesus he saw Moses and Elijah. Right? And so it's not an unheard of thing that spirits of individuals might be seen. Peter himself had seen Moses and Elijah, the spirits of Moses and Elijah. So they said, well, maybe you just saw his spirit or a ghost. But Peter himself keeps knocking, and when they opened the door, they saw him and were astonished. Well, you would be too, right? Now, think about this. They were astonished that Peter was there. What had they been praying about? What had they been praying for? Well, I don't know. But you have to think, surely their prayers would have included some. Could Peter be spared? Could something happen to save Peter's life? And now something obviously has happened to save Peter's life, but they're astonished at it. Well, we would be too, right? I don't think this is any put down on them or their faith. They are surprised. They are amazed. Verse 17, he, beckoning unto them with the hand to hold their peace, declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, go show these things unto James and to the brethren. And he departed and went into another place. So he said, just let me tell you what happened. And he explains to them how the angel had led him out. And then he says, go tell James and the others. And he left. He went someplace else. I don't know why. But it may have been because that was a place that was under surveillance or would be checked. When they found out he was missing from the prison, maybe this house of Mary was a well-known place that the authorities might check to see if he was there. And so he went someplace else. Now, I got another question for you. Who's this? Who is this James? Well, wait a minute. Well, this is just verse 17. And back up there at verse 2, he had killed James, the brother of John. He killed James the apostle. He killed James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John. That James is already dead. Now, there was another apostle named James, right? there was James, the son of Alphaeus, who was also one of the 12 apostles. And so there's a possibility that that could be this James, although most people think that this was not the remaining apostle James, James the son of Alphaeus. Most people think that this was James, who was the brother of Jesus, another son of Mary. In fact, look over in Galatians chapter 1. In Galatians chapter 1, remember we were talking about this after Paul's conversion and he went to Arabia, returned to Damascus. Verse 18, Galatians 1, then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter, abode with him 15 days. Other the apostles I saw I none, save James the Lord's brother. Now the things which I write to you, behold, they, so on he goes. Well, he didn't see any of the other apostles. The only other person he did see was James, the brother of our Lord. So James, the brother of Jesus, became a prominent leader in the church at Jerusalem. We think he had a prominent role to play in the meeting in Jerusalem that took place, we'll read about in Acts chapter 15. So most people, I don't know, I wouldn't want to adamantly say it has to be so, but it seems a pretty strong indication that this James is James, the brother of Jesus, which, by the way, he's also mentioned in the book of Jude. In fact, remember how Jude identifies himself? Jude, the servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, he goes on. We think that Jude was probably another brother of Jesus, which is really remarkable because we've pointed out a lot of times Jesus' own brothers did not believe in him initially. But after the resurrection, they were believers and apparently became active and leaders in the church. We think that's this James. Oh, wait.
So I want to go back to the prayer real quick.
Okay.
It said that they were praying very fervently. Well, they got what they wanted. They wanted Peter out of prison. They didn't want him to be executed. They got what they wanted. Do you know I know people that have prayed fervently for things in this life, fasted, prayed, and they didn't get things that they wanted. So how do you address that?
So your question is that they got what they wanted. Is something not working right if we don't get what we want? Is that, I guess, if I reword your question. Anybody have a thought on that? James?
Jesus prayed a prayer asking God for something that he didn't receive that specific request,
Yeah.
but he received what God's will was.
Right.
So we understand, we have to ask it according to God's will, first of all, and then the answer, now, later, we don't need it.
Yeah.
What you're asking for now.
Yeah, I think that's right. The prayers are answered in different ways. And sometimes the answer to prayer is no. And we don't get, in other words, if your loved one is sick and you pray that they might get well, and they don't get well, does that mean God doesn't hear and answer prayers? No, it just means that that's the answer to the prayer this time. And we have to be submissive to his greater will. Go ahead.
We know the Apostle Paul asked 3 times, he said, for his thorn in the flesh to be taken away. And Jesus said, my grace is sufficient for you. So the answer to his immediate question was no. And we have to accept that maybe whatever we are asking about, the answer is no, but maybe in some way or another, God's grace is sufficient for us in that matter. We don't know because we don't get direct revelation from God. But the Bible also tells us that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord. And sometimes we might not be in this life able to see what the good was.
Yeah.
But we have to accept by faith that God is taking care of us and he's going to work things out through his providence or whatever for our best interest. And understand that no matter what happens here, we've got a home in heaven if we'll be faithful to it. It may be that the no answer is a test for us. We don't know.
Yeah, exactly right. All right, all good thoughts. It's a real interesting narrative. We got just a few verses to finish up about this Herod here in Acts chapter 12. Lord willing, we'll deal with that next week. And I'll give you a little bit of an assignment to if you get a chance, investigate. In the coming verses, it talks about Herod being stricken with worms and dying. Is there some contradiction in the biblical account and the historical account about the death of this Herod Agrippa I? We'll talk about that next week, Lord willing.
The song of encouragement will be number 315 in our songbooks. Oh, why not tonight? Number 315. Before the invitation is given, we'll sing number 231. 231. Soldiers of Christ. Soldiers of Christ.
If you would, take your Bibles and turn to Exodus, the 15th chapter. Exodus 15, we'll start reading in verse 22. I was reminded of these this time when the children of Israel passed over the Red Sea, and so we want to take a few examples from them tonight for our invitation. Exodus 15, verse 22. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. So the people grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Then he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. There he made for them a statute and regulation, and there he tested them. And he said, "If you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you, which I put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer." You know, when God brought the children up out of Egypt, they grumbled against him here. God wanted the people to understand that he was going to provide for them and that he was going to be their God and that he would take care of them. Here we see that he provided water. In the next chapter, we read of the manna and the quail which he provided when they grumbled about wanting something to eat. And if you remember, he told them only to take enough manna in the morning for them to eat that day. And what happened when they took more? It spoiled. On the sixth day, though, they were to take a double portion because they weren't to gather on the seventh day. They were to rest on the seventh day. So God put some basic instructions for them in front of them to test them, to see whether or not they would be his people and that they would trust in him. I mean, think about that. Think about the trust that they were to have, that they'd have one day's food. But God wanted them to understand that he was going to provide for them. But he put a stipulation in place. We read there in verse 26, "If you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will not put the diseases on you, which I put on the Egyptians." There was a choice to be made, and if they followed him, he would take care of them, and he said he would not put these diseases on them. But turn over to chapter 16. You know, we mentioned the manna and the quail. And of course, on the sixth day, they were to gather up that double portion. But on the seventh day, many of them went out together. If we read that, we read there in chapter 16, verse 27, "And it came about on the seventh day that some of the people went out together, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions?" You know, we look at the children of Israel here and we think, you know, why could they not follow these basic instructions? But you know, today, God provides for us. God wants us to be his people. God has put forth basic instructions for us to follow, just as he did the children of Israel, to be his people. but do we keep his commandments? Could it be said of us, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments? If you're here tonight and you've not been baptized, why do you wait? What is hindering you from being baptized? But maybe you're here tonight and you have been baptized, and you think about your life and you know that there's sin there in your life. How long will you wait to do something about that sin? Tonight you have the opportunity to make your life right with God. Will you take that opportunity? How wonderful it would be to rid your soul of that sin and to be able to lay your head on your pillow tonight and know that you are a child of God once again. And you have that hope of heaven. If we can help you in any way tonight, make your life right with God, please come as we stand and sing.
Thank everybody for being here tonight. We appreciate your presence and your encouragement very much. Continue to pray for all those that are in special need of our prayers. Use the sick list. We still got copies of that from Sunday, and others also that we know of that may need our prayers. Keep all those in mind and reach out to those who may need our help. Remember the virtual Bible study on the internet tomorrow night at 8. We look forward to seeing you back here, Lord willing, Sunday morning at 9:30 for Bible study. Thanks everybody for being here. Let's be dismissed with a word of prayer.
Let us go to God in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, it is now, Lord, that we come to you at this time, Lord, to thank you for this wonderful day you've given us, Lord, to gather together and serve you. Pray, Lord, now that everything we have done tonight, Lord, has been well in accordance with your word. Pray, Lord, that you'll help us to take what we've learned tonight and apply it to our lives where need be. Pray, Lord, that you'll be with those of our number who are not able to be here due to sickness, Lord, that your healing hand will be upon them. Pray, Lord, also that you'll be with those who are spiritually sick, Lord, that something may be said or done to bring them back to a right state with you. Pray, Lord, now also that you will go with us, Lord, as we depart tonight, Lord, that you will be with us. Pray, Lord, that you'll help us to be an example this week, Lord, to those around us. Pray, Lord, that you'll help us to be back at the next appointed time. Forgive us for our sins. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.